The Battle of Gettysburg, a key moment in the American Civil War, is remembered for its strategic importance and the terrible injuries the soldiers suffered. On July 1863, Pennsylvania's fields turned into a nightmare as soldiers faced a storm of bullets, cannon fire, and brutal hand-to-hand combat. The result was some of the most horrific injuries in wartime history. In this video, you will get a clearer picture of the true cost of Gettysburg, a cost paid with immense pain and suffering. The clash between General George Meade's Union Army and General Robert E. Lee's Confederate forces led to devastating losses on both sides. In Meade's Union Army, which had about 93,000 soldiers, roughly 28% were either killed or badly wounded. An estimated 3,155 soldiers were killed, 14,529 were wounded, and 5,365 were missing. Lee's Confederate Army, with around 71,000 men, suffered even more, with over 31% of his soldiers killed or injured. An estimated 3,903 soldiers were killed, 18,735 were wounded, and 5,425 missing and captured. The total number of casualties for the battle was staggering. About 51,000 soldiers were killed, wounded, or went missing. By the end of the Gettysburg campaign, the number of casualties reached an estimated 64,000 for both sides combined. The scale of the devastation was almost unimaginable. Makeshift field hospitals were quickly overwhelmed, running out of medical supplies as surgeons worked around the clock, often without anesthesia, to save lives. The aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg was a scene of unimaginable horror and tragedy, with the land littered not only with the fallen, but also with the severed limbs of the wounded. Amputations were tragically common, often the result of devastating injuries inflicted by artillery shells or musket fire. At field hospitals near Gettysburg, piles of severed limbs bore witness to the grim reality faced by the wounded. One of the most heartbreaking stories from this period is that of Elizabeth Thorne, the wife of the town's largest cemetery owner. Despite being pregnant at the time, Thorne reportedly dug over 100 graves herself to accommodate the staggering number of casualties. The bodies, including those of Confederate soldiers, were laid to rest in makeshift graves close to where they fell on the battlefield. Among the horror tales is the story of a woman who fought for the Confederacy disguised as a man. Her body, like so many others, was discovered on Cemetery Ridge, a powerful reminder of the brave women who broke the rules of society to join the battle. Another woman, also disguised as a man, lost her leg during the charge up Cemetery Ridge. The situation at Gettysburg after the battle was truly dreadful. Many soldiers lay on the wet ground with nothing underneath them. There were countless amputations, and the soldiers' stumps rested directly on the ground. Most of these men had no clothes and nothing decent to eat. The doctors were completely overwhelmed. Without proper clothing, many soldiers were nearly naked and filthy, lying in the mud. They screamed, cried, and begged their friends or visitors for relief. They had no tents for shelter. To make matters worse, a powerful thunderstorm hit with strong winds and heavy rain. Many soldiers might have drowned in the downpour without some people's hard work. These descriptions show how bad things were for the wounded after the Battle of Gettysburg. The lack of necessities like bedding, clothing, food, and shelter worsened their suffering. Despite the efforts of the overworked doctors and volunteers, the conditions were truly terrible. Both Union and Confederate soldiers at Gettysburg faced a deadly combination of 19th-century military medicine and the destructive power of explosive artillery rounds and soft lead mini-balls. These mini-balls, designed for increased accuracy and range, inflicted particularly severe injuries. More than two-thirds of the gunshot wounds were to the leg or arm, causing devastating damage. The nature of these injuries was horrifying. When a mini ball struck a limb, it often caused a relatively small entrance wound, but a much larger exit wound. This was because the soft lead of the bullet would flatten or fragment upon impact, creating a larger hole as it exited. Sometimes, the bullets ricocheted or flattened even further, bringing dirt, clothing fibers, and other foreign materials into the wound, which increased the risk of infection. The extensive damage caused by the mini ball and its tendency to contaminate the wound led to a dramatic increase in infections. Medical knowledge at the time was limited, and sterile techniques were not yet understood. As a result, many soldiers who survived the initial impact of the bullet succumbed to infections such as gangrene. Private Jacob Henry Cole of the 57th New York Infantry provided a vivid account of his experience. "A bullet entered my right arm and went through it as we pushed forward. A shell detonated as we charged into the wheat field, killing 2 of my companions and shattering my right leg. Upon receiving a bullet wound to my arm, I experienced numbness similar to that of being struck on the elbow. I immediately turned to my colleague and asked why he had struck me. My leg broke, and I fell. I lay there confused for a few minutes before realizing that the enemies were surrounding me." Cole's account highlights the confusion and shock experienced by many soldiers. The numbness and initial disbelief upon being wounded, followed by the realization of severe injury, were common reactions. His shattered leg and the immediate loss of comrades illustrate the brutal and chaotic nature of the battle. The inadequacies of contemporary medical treatment compounded these injuries. The overwhelming number of casualties meant that medical personnel had to perform numerous amputations, often under unsanitary conditions. This high rate of amputation was necessary due to the nature of the injuries, but it also exposed soldiers to further risks of infection and death. After the Battle of Gettysburg, surgeons faced immense challenges treating countless wounded soldiers. One of the procedures they performed was excision, where a broken piece of bone was removed. Unfortunately, these operations were even riskier than amputations, with higher death rates. Amputations were extremely common and often had to be done quickly, sometimes as frequently as every 10 minutes, especially through the night. This was because so many soldiers were severely injured, and rapid action was necessary to try and save lives. For minor injuries, doctors used basic treatments. They would pack the wound with lint, wrap it with a wet bandage, and, if there was time, remove any foreign objects from the wound. However, injuries to the head, neck, chest, and abdomen received very little attention. Medical knowledge and technology were limited, so there was often little doctors could do for these serious wounds. Most of these patients were given pain medicine and left to die, as there was no effective treatment available. One soldier shared his experience. "I was wounded in my left arm during a fight near Gettysburg on Friday afternoon. A musket shot broke my arm above the elbow. When I got to the hospital on Saturday the 4th, doctors amputated my arm that afternoon. They removed it at the middle section, leaving only 6 inches. I was under chloroform and didn't feel the operation. But the following days were very painful. Still, I think I'm recovering well." This soldier's story shows the harsh reality many faced. Even though chloroform helped during the surgery, the pain afterward was intense. Despite the hardships, he felt hopeful and trusted the doctors. The constant work of the surgeons, the basic care for minor wounds, and the tragic neglect of severe cases highlight the difficulties of Civil War medicine. The experiences of the wounded and the tireless efforts of medical staff reveal the brutal realities and resilience during this period. High-speed bullets and pieces of exploding shells caused many facial injuries. The bullets used back then could cause severe damage when they hit a soldier's face, breaking bones and causing serious disfigurement. Shrapnel from artillery explosions could also cause burns, deep cuts, and mutilation of facial features. These injuries were particularly bad because the face is a complex body with many bones, muscles, and nerves. Injuries included broken jaws, shattered cheekbones, and the loss of eyes, noses, and parts of the scalp. The dirty battlefield conditions and the lack of advanced medical care made these injuries even worse, often leading to infections and long-lasting pain. For those who survived their injuries, the long-term effects were significant. Beyond the physical pain and disability, soldiers had to deal with severe psychological and social consequences. In a time when appearance was important for social interactions and self-esteem, facial disfigurement often led to isolation and stigma. Many injured soldiers became withdrawn, avoiding public places to escape the negative reactions from others. Reconstructive surgery was just beginning during the Civil War. Some surgeons started developing techniques that would later become the basis for plastic surgery. But these methods were not yet advanced or widely available. Early attempts at reconstruction were basic and often left soldiers with noticeable scars. It wasn't until many years later that more advanced reconstructive techniques became available. But for many veterans, these advancements came too late. Private Joseph Harvey's injury, caused by a shell rather than a bullet, highlights the brutal nature of facial wounds during the Battle of Gettysburg. Harvey described the moment he was hit. "It felt like the floodgates in my neck opened, releasing a torrent of blood. It seemed like I had a chicken bone in my mouth, something loosely resting on my left cheek. It was part of my jaw that was floating around in my mouth after it broke off, teeth and all." Captured by the enemy, Harvey was held prisoner for 11 days before being hospitalized at Alexandria's Mansion House Hospital in mid-July 1863. In August, surgeons removed fragments of the shattered bone. Due to the extensive damage to his cheek, liquids and saliva would leak out as the wound had not fully healed. Harvey also suffered partial facial paralysis on the right side and mild deafness. Despite his severe injuries, Harvey was granted a pension for his service. Tragically, he passed away on December 9, 1868, from unknown causes, marking the end of a life deeply scarred by the horrors of war. Infection was one of the most fearsome and deadly consequences of the injuries sustained during the Battle of Gettysburg. The lack of advanced medical knowledge and sanitary practices turned minor wounds into life-threatening conditions, making infection a critical factor in the overall casualty rate of the Civil War. In the mid-19th century, medical professionals needed a greater understanding of germ theory. The prevailing belief was that miasmas, or bad air, was the primary cause of disease. Consequently, the medical practices of the time often inadvertently contributed to the spread of infection. Surgeons operated with unwashed hands and reused instruments without sterilization between patients. This oversight was particularly devastating in wartime field hospitals' chaotic and crowded conditions. One of the most feared infections was gangrene, a condition where body tissue dies due to a lack of blood supply, often exacerbated by bacterial infection. Soldiers with severe wounds frequently developed gangrene, characterized by the blackening and decay of flesh. The foul odor and the rapid spread of this infection led to extreme measures, such as amputation, to prevent it from reaching vital organs and spreading further. Another common and deadly infection was sepsis, a systemic response to infection that could lead to organ failure and death. Symptoms included high fever, rapid heart rate, difficulty breathing, and confusion. Once sepsis set in, the chances of survival plummeted given the limited treatment options available. Often called lockjaw, tetanus is caused by bacteria entering the body through wounds. It leads to muscle stiffness and spasms, frequently resulting in a drawn-back head, clenched fists, and arched back. The mortality rate for tetanus is extremely high due to the lack of effective treatment. The toll of infection was staggering. Estimates suggest that for every soldier who died in battle, 2 or 3 died from disease, with infections accounting for a significant proportion of these deaths. The suffering caused by infections extended beyond the battlefield, affecting soldiers long after the conflict ended. Many who survived their initial injuries faced chronic pain, disability, and recurrent infections. The impact of diseases during the Civil War, particularly at the Battle of Gettysburg, cannot be overstated. It is a chilling fact that more lives were claimed by illnesses such as diarrheal diseases, smallpox, malaria, and yellow fever than by the wounds inflicted on the battlefield itself. Another sad reality is that many soldiers fell ill even before facing combat. The unsanitary conditions of military camps, combined with inadequate nutrition and exposure to the elements, created a breeding ground for diseases. Diarrheal illnesses, caused by contaminated water and food, spread rapidly among troops, leading to dehydration, weakness, and sometimes death. Smallpox, a highly contagious virus, ravaged both Union and Confederate forces, claiming lives and leaving survivors scarred for life. Malaria and yellow fever, endemic to certain regions where battles were fought, posed significant health risks to soldiers. The stagnant waters of marshes and swamps provided breeding grounds for the mosquitoes that transmitted these diseases. Fever, chills, and debilitating fatigue were common symptoms, often incapacitating soldiers and rendering them unable to fight. In the aftermath of the Battle of Gettysburg, soldiers faced not only physical injuries, but also invisible wounds that left lasting scars on their minds. The mental toll of war was immense, with soldiers experiencing intense stress, fear, and trauma on the battlefield. Many soldiers suffered from what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. They were haunted by nightmares, unable to shake the memories of the horrors they had witnessed, and lived in constant fear of what might happen next. However, seeking help for mental distress was often seen as a sign of weakness, leaving many soldiers to suffer in silence. The lack of understanding about mental health at the time meant that treatment options were limited. Field hospitals were overwhelmed with physical injuries, leaving little time or resources for addressing soldiers' psychological needs. As a result, many veterans struggled to reintegrate into civilian life after the war, facing increased rates of substance abuse, homelessness, and suicide. It wasn't until much later that the mental injuries of Civil War veterans began to receive the attention they deserved. With advancements in psychiatry and a greater understanding of trauma, we now recognize the lasting impact of war on the human psyche. The true horror of Gettysburg is not just in the physical wound. It is also a wake-up call to future generations about the terrible cost of war. Kindly give us a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button for more videos. Thanks for watching.